and wide all over the world, results have ranged from the exquisite and exclusive to the strictly utilitarian. And all sorts of things have been knitted. In the 20s and 30s, knitting met fashion, and the results were stunning, dramatic designs. Many marvellous techniques were then pioneered, which are still relevant to the fashion knitter of today. Monsey Stanley has investigated all aspects of hand knitting technique, assembling just about everything there is to know in her excellent Hand Knitter's Handbook. This programme will show you many of the techniques in the book and open your eyes to exciting new possibilities.
To improve your knitting techniques, forget all the rules. Each situation requires a different solution. The way you cast on, or increase, or sew up depends on your pattern, your yarn, and the effect you want to achieve. This program will help you develop the knack of weighing up each case and finding the best solution.
The best place to start looking at hand knitting technique is with casting on. And here we'll see how some simple variations can give you a range of interesting effects. Say that you've always cast on with your thumb. Have you noticed that the resulting edge has two sides? Naturally, depending on the particular pattern you're working on, one side will look better than the other. For example, this is stocking stitch, and it looks better if the first row after casting on is a purl row. With a knit row, we get these little bumps, not a very even result. Using the same thumb cast on with garter stitch also gives two noticeably different effects. Here, the cast on gives a clear edge, while on the other side, it looks like a garter stitch row that has shrunk. Now, using the same cast on with knit one, purl one rib, on one side we get little bumps at the bottom of the knit stitches, and on the other we get a rolling line defining the edge, which is better because it has more character. There is a quicker way of casting on. Use your index finger, like this. Of course, to get a nice even edge, the tension must be right. So, if your edge is too slack, use a finer needle, and if it's too tight, use a thicker needle. Pull the left strand to adjust the loop, and keep the right strand at your usual working tension. The index finger cast on results in stitches angling in the opposite direction from the thumb cast on. The loop cast on is ideal for lace or very stretchy patterns. Use the simplest of loops on two needles held together. When you're ready, withdraw one needle to knit, carefully keeping the stitches under control with your left hand. Take care here, it can be a bit tricky. For less open patterns, you can get good results by using the popular method of knitting into the last stitch. Let's look at some examples and see the effect. Here, the cast on blends well with the mesh pattern on both sides. But with solid patterns, like ribbing, this cast on doesn't look good from either side. And with garter stitch, the effect is equally unsuitable. By contrast, see how nice garter stitch looks with a cable cast on, especially from this side. Choosing the correct cast on for the pattern is a vital element for the success of your garment. For cable cast on, you knit between the last two stitches. But although ideal for garter stitch, this cast on is no good for ribbing, as it's too heavy and inelastic. This is a much better method for ribbing. It's alternate cable cast on. This is achieved simply by alternating a knit stitch with a purl stitch. On the first row after casting on, work all the stitches through the back. But remember, if the last stitch of your cast on was a knit, then you must start the first row with a knit. If you ended with a purl, then start with a purl. Many knitters do have problems with buttonholes, and a few simple hints might help you here. A very common problem is this unsightly strand at the corner, which happens with knitted cast on and cable cast on, and it's simple to avoid. Just cast off in the usual way. Then on the return row, use knitted or cable cast on. But the key to the whole operation is to bring the yarn to the front of the work before you place the last stitch onto the left needle. Then turn the work to finish the row in the usual way, and you'll have a neat and tidy buttonhole. If you'd like to try a different method of casting on for buttonholes, loop the yarn with your left hand and make a stitch into the loop. When finished, the resulting buttonhole matches very well with the bumpy side of a thumb cast on. And here's another way, using a double twist loop, which blends very well with the smooth side of the work. Take the yarn with your index finger and give it a double twist. In ribbing, buttonholes look best if they start and end with a purl stitch. And here's the double twist loop cast on, the buttonhole cast on, and the cable cast on. The bat wings of this garment have a lovely flowing action, which has been achieved by casting on at the shoulders, and then knitting down rather than up. It's quite an easy thing to do, using a provisional cast on. This method avoids the shoulder seam altogether and gives a smooth, even result. All you need is a contrast base to start knitting from, and you can use any cast on technique here. Then to work in the opposite direction, snip away the cast on and pick up the stitches with a fine needle. When you start knitting, you might discover that some stitches have become twisted while picking them up. See here how the back of the loop is nearest to the tip of the needle. Normally you would work into the front of the loop, but now you have to work into the back to straighten the stitch. And here's another twisted stitch, so again work into the back. The new piece is half a stitch offline. With stocking stitch, this only shows at the edges, but in ribbing and in many other patterns, every stitch would be distorted. In such cases, it might be necessary to introduce a few rows of stocking stitch to achieve satisfactory results. Another excellent provisional cast-on starts with a crochet chain, worked with a fairly thick hook. To fasten the last stitch, simply snip and pull. Now turning the chain over so that you see a series of bumps running down the middle. You'll start to work on the second from the end, ignoring the last link made. Insert your knitting needle and draw a loop through. Repeat all the way down the chain. And of course it's easier to work if the chain is fairly loose. Now you're ready to work in the opposite direction, and you'll see why it was necessary to leave the last stitch on the chain, because it acts as an anchor. Release it by pulling the central strand through, and this unravels the chain and leaves the stitches ready to be picked up. A provisional edge is also used in tubular cast-on, the neatest way to start ribbing. Cast on half the stitches you need plus one. With the main yarn, knit one Then wrap the yarn around the needle and knit the next one. And repeat all along the first row to double the stitches. On the next row, knit one, yarn forward, slip one purlwise, yarn back, knit one, yarn forward, slip one, yarn back, and so on. Work 4 rows like this, always knitting the stitches that you slipped in the previous row. Continue in knit one, purl one rib, and when the rib is finished, unpick the contrast yarn. The 4 rows at the start do tend to give a slack edge, and to avoid this it's a good idea to use needles a couple of sizes finer while casting on, and then change to the usual size when you get to the rib. Notice how the knit stitches from one side continue over to the other, a very neat rounded edge. A tubular cast-off will also give you a neat edge for ribbing. Work 4 rows of knit one, slip one, as before, and this is called tubular stocking stitch and will give you 2 very short but separate layers of stocking stitch held by the same needle. To practice the cast-off, you can separate the layers and put them on different needles. If you want to try this, you'll find it easier with fine needles. And now you can clearly see that the layers are only connected at the sides. To finish the cast-off, the 2 layers have to be grafted together. And let's first see how this is done with 2 flat pieces of stocking stitch. Using a contrast yarn shows this technique very clearly. Go into the centre of the lower stitch and take purlwise the first stitch on the lower needle. Then go into the centre of the upper stitch and take knitwise the first stitch on the upper needle. This gives you a new row of knitting. In practice, of course, you'll be using a matching yarn and the join will be quite undetectable. Let's go back to the original piece of ribbing and see how to graft the stitches from a single needle. If the first stitch is a knit, take purlwise the first and second knit stitches, dropping the first off the needle. Now go knitwise into the first purl stitch and drop it off the needle, going round the back, take knitwise the second purl stitch and drop the next 2 stitches. Go into the last knit stitch and take purlwise the next one on the needle. Now into the last stitch on the back and knitwise into the next purl stitch. Repeat the last 2 movements and continue in this way. Tubular cast-off is an excellent way of casting off necklines and avoids the need for a folded band. But remember to work very loosely with small openings such as crew necks that need to go over the head. Let's have a look at some examples to see the difference in results. Here's the tubular cast-off, which is far better than the standard method, whether you knit all the stitches and leave a flat chain-like edge, or whether you alternate knit and purl to turn the chain on its side. Like cast-ons, most cast-offs have 2 very different sides. Here, for example, is garter stitch with a basic cast-off from this side, and here, from the other side, a perfect blend. Joining front bands of ribbing is best done at the back of the neck, because some elasticity will be lost and it'll leave a kink. Grafting will give you the best join. Divide each section, placing the purl stitches on a safety pin and the knit stitches onto a needle. Grafting as you've seen before, go into the centre of the upper stitch and take knitwise the stitch on the upper needle. Then go into the centre of the lower stitch and take purlwise the stitch on the lower needle, and so on. Then turn and repeat on the other side. But make sure to add 1 or 2 extra stitches at the side to even up the kink, like this. In practice, of course, you'd be using the same colour yarn, but this contrasting yarn shows the process much more clearly. When the second side is complete, you can see how very good this join is for 2 narrow bands of ribbing. If the bands are in a textured pattern, like this moss stitch, an effective join can be achieved by threading the free loops with a length of yarn, taking 1 stitch from each needle. It can be a bit fiddly to start with, but the process is really quite simple. Take 1 stitch from the front, 1 from the back, and carry on to the end. When all the stitches are done, pull the yarn and you'll see how precisely the 2 pieces intermesh. Now to finish off, turn over and thread the yarn in the opposite direction. Straighten up the stitches and you can see, even with this contrasting yarn, how neatly the 2 bands are joined together.
Another point about front bands is that to keep a good shape, the edge stitch must be quite firm. It is often best to slip it knitwise at the beginning of a row and then to knit it at the end of the next row.
Front bands are often worked separately, but knitting them at the same time as the main pattern is really more convenient and it saves sewing them on. When the front band is in ribbing like this one, it requires finer needles than the main pattern. So if you want to knit across, you must pull the yarn really tight when working the band. Plan the band with a succession of knit stitches up and down the edge, keeping in mind that this isn't actually the last stitch. The last stitch folds back here and forms a nice even edge. And this effect is achieved by a slipped garter selvage. This is the ribbed band of the right front. Knit the last stitch of the row and then on the front side slip it knitwise at the start of the next row, and remember to work the band as tightly as you can. For a left front matching this right front, you must purl the last stitch, then slip it purlwise at the start of the next row. A marker is useful to show you where the band ends. Slip it over and then change to the main pattern, knitting at your usual tension. After a while, because you're pulling the yarn so tightly on this section, the band will start to look short. This is very easy to correct, simply by adding 2 extra rows. Knit to the marker, turn and go back. And now you can see how the length of the band has evened out. You'll see a small hole has appeared here, but as you carry on with the band, this will become unnoticeable. Good shaping is another essential for the success of your garment. This is again the right front band, and we need to decrease for a V-neck. Drop the marker, slip the last stitch back onto the left needle and purl 2 together. Now put back the marker and carry on. To identify each decrease, catch it with a safety pin. As you knit on, the pins will make counting increases very easy. The left front can also be decreased in this way. Purling together the last pattern stitch and the first stitch of the band. Comparing the right and left fronts, they look the same from the right side, but from the reverse side they're quite different. On the right front we have a very smooth line because the decrease angles in the same direction as the neckline. The breaking point here is due to the 2 short rows added to the band earlier on. On the left front, the decreases in the neckline have opposite angles, and this causes a stitch from the main pattern to cut into the band. To match both sides, you must decrease the left front from the reverse side. On reaching the marker, slip knitwise the last band stitch, drop the ring, slip knitwise the next stitch, and then knit them together. Replace the marker and carry on. You may want to decrease the right front from the reverse side too. In this case, slip the last stitch of the main pattern purlwise, drop the marker, put the stitch back onto the left needle, replace the marker, and knit together the first knit stitch of the band and the last purl stitch of the pattern. Knit 2 together and slip slip knit are paired decreases. You can place them 2 or 3 stitches in from the edge. A very useful technique for decorating raglan seams, necklines and similar areas. Chevrons and V-necks are particularly suited to the creative use of decreases. These can be put side by side every few rows. Here, slip slip knit on the left, knit 2 together on the right. And here, knit 2 together on the left and slip slip knit on the right gives an interesting effect. You can even alternate one decrease from the right and one from the left in consecutive rows for a more unusual detail. Instead of pairs of decreases, you can have one double decrease converging into a straight central knit stitch. Work up to 1 stitch before the central stitch. Then slip together knitwise the central stitch and the next one. Knit the following stitch and pass the 2 slipped stitches over. This involves only 3 stitches, compared with the 4 of the other methods, which is sometimes preferable. When you reach the shoulder line, you might need to cast off in sections to make a slope. If the cast off falls on a purl row, as in this case, it's a good idea to take the yarn to the back of the work in this way before passing one stitch over the other. And again. When the first section has been cast off, just carry on to the end as usual. On the return row, knit up to the last stitch before the cast off section. Then turn the work and slip the first stitch purlwise and cast it off with the stitch left on the needle. Cast off the rest of the section in the usual way and finish the row. After shaping the shoulders, you might need to continue with the rib band. right up to the back of the neck. Drop the marker and continue the band with a slipped garter selvage on each side. Slip the first stitch purlwise, then purl the next stitch. The band is disengaged before casting off the last group of shoulder stitches to make it easier to sew up the shoulders. The outer edge is finished by knitting the last stitch and then slipping it knitwise at the start of the next row. The inner edge is finished by purling the last stitch, then slipping it purlwise at the start of the next row. To finish the last section of the shoulder cast-off, you need to add a new piece of yarn. Work one row, turn the knitting as before, and cast off the last shoulder stitches. Now you can see the band on one side and a very gentle shoulder slope on the other, with a break over the last couple of rows that leaves the band free. This will allow you to neatly turn the shoulder edge into the seam, like so, without the band getting in the way. Increases, like decreases, can also be paired. You can make a stitch by knitting into the row below, and then into the stitch itself. And you can mirror this effect by knitting first into the stitch and then into the row below. This method gives a very good result. The first increase angles to the right and the second angles to the left, with just a small tidy hole in each. This method is similar to the last in that you knit into the stitch below, but not into the centre as before. This time you knit into the purl head at the back and then into the stitch. For the mirror image, knit first into the stitch, then catch the stitch below with your left needle and knit into that. This lifted increase is one of the least detectable of increases, leaving virtually no hole in the pattern. But if you need to work several increases, one on top of each other, because you're knitting into the row below, this method will pull the fabric, unless the increases are done very loosely. If you prefer to wrap the yarn around the needle, you can do it in two ways. Back to front on the right-hand side, and when you reach the left-hand side, wrap the yarn front to back. On the next row, you'll have to decide between two options and find out which is best for you. First, when you reach the increases, you can simply knit them as they come, which tends to leave a large hole. This is the eyelet increase. The second option is the closed eyelet increase, and here, instead of working the increase as it comes, you twist it, and this effectively gets rid of the hole. And again, this time through the front. Comparing the two, you can see that the first eyelet increase method results in a large hole. But with the second method, simply by twisting the strand, it makes a much smaller hole. Here, instead of wrapping the yarn around the needle, you pick up the strand between two stitches and work into it. In this case, both sides are worked in the same way, and the result is smaller than an eyelet but larger than a closed eyelet increase. A simple variation on the theme is the strand increase, and here, instead of working the strand as it comes, you pick it up from the back and twist it by knitting into the front. And to match the increase, you pick the strand up from the front and knit into the back of it. The results are very similar to those of the previous two increases, with the twisted version leaving the smallest hole. But because no extra yarn is added, the increases are more compact and can draw on the adjoining stitches and tighten them. Circumstances will tell you which increase is best to use in a particular case. Eyelet increases on either side of a central stitch here have become part of this lace pattern. On the other hand, the many lifted increases in this front are undetectable because they're all worked on plain rows so that the fancy pattern remains unbroken. Leaving a long tail of yarn when casting on or casting off makes life much easier when it comes to sewing up. To make sure that the tail doesn't get in the way before it's needed, wind it with your fingers and tie it into a neat butterfly. Ladder stitch is often the best method for sewing up. Ideally, the two sides need the same number of rows, but don't worry if they're one row off. The pattern must carry right up to the last stitch, so don't slip it. To get a firm edge, pull the yarn tight at the start of the row, especially on purl rows. It's important to obtain a smooth foundation line by working one or more figures of 8 across the start. Catch one side between the first and second stitches, and then the other. And then back to the first one again. Tighten up the yarn carefully but firmly and assess the edge. It looks like another stitch here will even it up, creating a baseline without kinks. Now turn the work sideways, and always working with the right side up, start the ladder stitch seam by picking up one horizontal strand between the first and second stitches from the edge. There. Then cross over and do the same on the other side. And simply keep going from one side to the other, tightening and correcting the tension as necessary. Always picking up the horizontal strand between the first and second stitches from the edge on each side. And you can see now how the two sides are beginning to mesh together. And a perfect final result. On the other side, you see one edge stitch from each side taken in, which is fine because the edges are never very tidy and it's best to tuck them away. In fact, if the two sides were the same colour, it would be impossible to spot this seam. Ladder stitch can give invisible seams to many patterns. The knitting must be planned to carry on unbroken over the seam, allowing one stitch from each side to be taken in. For example, on knit 1 purl 1 rib, one side must end in knit and the other in purl. On knit 2 purl 2 rib, one side must end with 3 knit stitches and the other with 3 purl stitches, and here the line of knit stitches very effectively hides the seam because it's raised. Ladder stitch can be adapted to many situations. Here, for example, we have 2 cast-off edges representing a typical shoulder seam. Start again with the figure of 8 to make the seam nice and firm right at the edge. And notice how important it is to cast off smoothly, as it gives you well-matched edges to sew up. Work right under the cast-off chain because this is to be kept out of sight, neatly turned in. And this is why you need a gap between the front band and the top of the shoulders. If the stitches are large, work your ladder seam half a stitch at a time, going from one side to the other and moving gradually from one group of stitches onto the next. If you were sewing 2 pieces with increases or decreases right at the edge, you'd also have to move gradually when they occurred to achieve a straight seam line without any steps. Be careful when you get into a situation like this where a nasty hole could spoil the seam. Always work around it, taking 2 or 3 strands together to close the gap. The finished seam is neat and even, and firm enough to keep a classic shoulder line in place. When sewing a sleeve to a straight armhole, you'll be joining stitches to rows, and the first thing to do is to pin one side to the other. Starting with the centre sleeve and the shoulder seam, put the knitting edge to edge without overlapping and keep the safety pins quite flat. Then pin one edge of the sleeve to the start of the armhole, which sometimes will be clearly marked with a few cast-off stitches. If not, count the rows to the shoulder, pin the other side to match and add a few more pins in between. Now start the seam at the edge, but this time a figure of 8 is not necessary. Simply make 1 or 2 stitches and then remove the first safety pin. On the sleeve side, work right under the chain, catching either half a stitch or 1 stitch, depending on what seems best at the time. On the other side, catch either 1 or 2 strands. The idea is to catch as much as required to keep the seam flat and even at all times. And here's the finished seam. Again, a perfect blending of 2 pieces of knitting. And with a garment of one colour, the joins would be almost invisible. If a seam turns out to be stiff and bulky, it can be easily softened with blocking. Pin it the wrong way up with masses of 2-inch glass-headed pins, pushed right down to their heads, on both sides of the seam. Then dampen it well and leave to dry, and when it's ready, unpin and you'll have a much softer seam. The edge of the knitting isn't always tucked into the seam. Neckbands, for example, are kept flat when they're attached to the centre back. This time, use a slip stitch, catching the back below the cast-off chain and then the heads of the band selvage, one at a time.
You can also devise other kinds of seams. For example, if you have a moss stitch bodice, you can fit the sleeve somewhere in, slip a stitch in the sleeve onto the pearl head of the moss stitch, and that gives you a very neat finish.
Backstitch can be used to sew one piece on top of another. Pick up the last stitch, work into the bottom layer, drop the next stitch and work into the following one. Then pick up the dropped stitch, work into the bottom layer, drop the next stitch, and so on. And the result looks rather like a purl row. If you're planning to work a band across, you'll need to knit up stitches along the edge of the knitting. And it's a good idea to prepare for it beforehand. In vertical edges, a chain selvage is ideal, and here's a strip with chain selvages on both sides. On right side rows, slip the first stitch knitwise, and then carry on knitting to the end of the row in the appropriate pattern. And then knit the last stitch. On wrong side rows, slip the first stitch purlwise and purl the last stitch when you get to it. Knitting stitches are usually wider than they are tall, so you have to divide the edge into lengths and work out how many stitches to knit up across from each. Say that each length needs 6 stitches, starting from the bottom pin. On the first length we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 chains, and on the second we have 4 chains, giving an average of 4.5 chains from which to knit up 6 stitches. Now catch the whole chain and knit into it. Catch some of the tight spots between chains as well to add the necessary stitches. And it's best to use a fine needle for picking up, changing back to the normal size on the next row. And there's the 6th stitch on this section, going on to 6 more on the next. And here's the final result. A very clean line at the seam and a smooth, even chain on the inside. With a curve, it's best to cast off in groups, as shown for the shoulders, and to give a chain selvage to the vertical sections. Divide the curve into lengths with safety pins, and knit up the same number of stitches from each length. In this case, there's 8 stitches per group. Again, using a finer needle to make the job easier. When knitting up, always work at least 2 strands away from the edge to avoid holes. Keep a smooth curve, even if that means occasionally going further from the edge. You might find it useful to tack the shape of the curve before you start knitting up. If there's a large group of stitches at the centre, don't get tempted to keep them on a holder. To ensure a smooth line and equally sized stitches, they should be cast off and knitted up again. And here you can see a nice, even line with no gaps. And all the groups of the finished curve, again smooth and neat. A clean join with no holes. Let's go back to basics. The main worry when casting off is the danger of dropping stitches off the needles. The last stitch gets very close to the tip of the needle, and the natural reaction is to pull the yarn tight when passing the other stitch over. But now the stitch must be loosened. Tighten, pass the stitch over and loosen. And it is vital to loosen off after each stitch, or the cast-off will be too tight and will pull and distort the shape of your garment. When you reach the last stitch, leaving a length of yarn might be handy for sewing up later. And here comes one of the most satisfying moments of your knitting. Cut the yarn and pull the stitch with the needle, and nothing can unravel now. The basic method isn't a very decorative cast-off. With other stitches, you will need other methods. Here, use a thick sewing needle, go knitwise into the second stitch, and then purlwise into the first. Knitwise into the second stitch again, and purlwise into the first, and so on. This cast-off is ideal in those cases when a two-strand cast-on has been used in other parts of the garment. And it creates a very nice rope-like effect, reflecting the smooth side of the cast-on. This method is excellent to match the bumpy side of a two-strand cast-on. You go into the first two stitches purlwise, then into the first knitwise, into the next two purlwise, and into the first knitwise, and so on. In effect, you're simply reversing the stitch sequence which we saw for stem stitch cast-off. And the result looks like the bumpy side of the two-strand cast-on that we saw right at the beginning.
I have only been able to touch on a few of the many fascinating techniques that can give a fashion garment that distinctive, special feeling. It is very exciting to go on discovering new ones and even to develop your own. In fact, the more you know, the freer you become, and the better you are able to concentrate on the more creative aspects of knitting.